The chamber buzzed with anticipation as delegates from over 400 species filled the vast hall of the Interstellar Assembly. The air crackled with the usual hum of political maneuvering and covert alliances. This was an event decades in the making. Humanity, Terrans, as they were known across the stars, had finally earned their place at the table. It was a victory, both symbolic and real, for the young human race. Ambassador Elena Kessler stood at the head of the Terran delegation, her dark eyes scanning the faces before her. As she had been briefed, the majority of the assembly had been eagerly awaiting this moment. Would humanity choose to join the fold as a willing, albeit cautious, partner? Or would they come with demands, expecting to reshape the delicate balance of power? The galaxy's most powerful species had been in session for centuries, and Earth was still a newcomer. Yet no one could deny humanity's swift rise. 1,000 years ago, they had been a fractured, war-torn species. Now they commanded fleets capable of rivaling the oldest and most powerful galactic empires. Kessler straightened her back, the weight of history on her shoulders. The assembly room, a monumental structure built to accommodate all the alien species, grew quieter as she walked toward the center podium. A hologram of the galactic map hovered above her, dotted with the emblems of all the member races. A chorus of murmurs rippled through the room. Terrans were not known for subtlety, nor for playing by anyone's rules but their own. What would they do? What would they say? With a deep breath, Kessler spoke. Honored members of the Interstellar Assembly, her voice rang out, calm yet resonant. We stand before you today, not as subordinates, not as allies, but as equals. Her words were measured, controlled. Yet to those who knew the human race, there was a quiet intensity in her delivery. Kessler's reputation as a negotiator was built on an unshakable confidence, a willingness to let silence stretch into discomfort rather than speak prematurely. The silence in the room deepened. Kessler's statement was not bold, at least, not in the way many had expected. Humanity had been prepared to make demands, but instead they chose to be unyielding in their own right to exist on equal footing. Her message was simple, but it carried the weight of a centuries-old struggle. The delegates from the Uricans, a highly sophisticated insectoid race, exchanged looks. The Kalani, an amphibious species known for their patience, shifted uneasily. The usually calm and collected Baron, an artificial intelligence race that had served as mediators for centuries, seemed agitated, their gleaming orbs of light flickering slightly. Kessler's eyes narrowed as she continued, her next words cutting through the tension. We will no longer be the galaxy's scapegoat or your pawn in political games. We fought for this moment, and we expect more than promises. The murmurs that had rippled before now swelled, rippling into discontent. For the first time, the full weight of humanity's defiance settled in. The delegates were no longer in control of the narrative. The Terrans were. And with that, the galaxy would never be the same again. The buzz of discomfort from the assembly hall lingered long after Kessler's statement. While many in the room tried to maintain their composure, the atmosphere was thick with the unspoken truth. Humanity had arrived, and they were no longer asking for permission. To understand the gravity of this moment, one had to look back, not to the hopeful promises of peace or the diplomatic niceties, but to the Orion conflicts, a name etched into the memory of every species that had once called themselves an ally of Earth. It was a time when the galaxy's most powerful races had underestimated the Terrans, believing they could be contained or controlled like so many others before them. The year was 2164 when humanity first clashed with the established galactic powers. Their fleets, still young and unrefined compared to the ancient civilizations of the Assembly, had been underestimated, dismissed as desperate, unpolished soldiers. What the galaxy didn't count on was the human will to survive, to innovate, and to fight back. The first strike had been a small skirmish at the edge of the Orion Nebula. Terran colonies, established in what was considered neutral space, were suddenly attacked by an invading force from the Arcturian hegemony. They were powerful, well-organized, and assumed the Terrans would capitulate as easily as the smaller, more pliable races they had conquered. But the Terrans fought back fiercely, using tactics and technologies that the hegemony wasn't prepared for. The clash escalated. For every Terran ship lost, 2 hegemony vessels were destroyed in retaliation. Soon, entire sectors were embroiled in a war, and the galaxy's most feared empires turned their attention toward humanity. What followed was a decade of brutal conflict. The Assembly called it a containment operation, though the Terrans had always seen it as something far darker. An extermination campaign. Hundreds of human colonies were destroyed, entire populations wiped out in the crossfire. What was left of humanity's fleet was battered and bruised, but still standing. It was not just military might that drove humanity's survival, though. It was a shared history of resilience, of being discarded and forgotten by the rest of the galaxy. There was no interstellar council to save them. No one came to their aid when they fought for their survival. In the face of extinction, humanity learned to rely on no one but themselves. They'd rebuilt their fleets. They restructured their societies. And when the war finally ended with a bitter treaty, the galaxy believed it had been pacified. But in truth, it had only sown the seeds for a new kind of humanity, one that would no longer cower in the face of oppression. Kessler knew this history all too well. As she prepared for the next round of negotiations, the faces of the dead, the forgotten, flickered in her mind. She was not here to bury that past. She was here to make sure it would never be repeated. The Assembly might have thought they were witnessing humanity's first step into the galactic fold, but in reality, they were about to see the first move in a game they could not yet understand. The silence that followed Kessler's declaration felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket over the chamber. Every species in the room, each with its own complex history, found themselves questioning the same thing. What did humanity want? Kessler stood tall at the podium, her eyes fixed on the assembly before her. No one spoke. No one moved. The other delegations, accustomed to diplomatic theater, were now faced with a new kind of challenge. A human ambassador who offered no political games, no flowery rhetoric, and no compromises. Finally, the first voice broke the silence. A sharp, authoritative tone belonging to the Lecteri representative. The Lecteri, a massive reptilian race known for their physical strength and aggression, had long held sway in the assembly. Their empire spanned thousands of systems, and their reputation for conquest was unrivaled. As their delegate spoke, his eyes locked onto Kessler with a cold, calculating gaze. "You speak of equality, Ambassador, but we know nothing of that. The assembly is about maintaining order that your species has only just begun to comprehend." The Lecteri representative sneered. "You demand respect, but you have yet to earn it. You've barely earned your place here." Kessler didn't flinch. She didn't respond immediately, letting his words hang in the air like a challenge. The Lecteri's arrogance was predictable, but she understood their position. They saw humanity as a potential threat, one that could upend the fragile balance they'd worked so hard to maintain. But they had miscalculated. "I don't ask for your respect," Kessler finally replied, her voice as cold and sharp as the Lecteri's own. "I demand your recognition." The words cut through the room like a blade. The Lecteri representative stiffened, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Recognition, not deference, not submission. Recognition of humanity's place among the stars. The debate erupted into chaos. Each race in the room had their own agenda. Some backed the Lecteri's view of a strict, hierarchical order. Others, particularly the smaller species who had long been oppressed by the larger empires, watched the Terrans with growing curiosity. The older, more established powers of the galaxy feared humanity's audacity. The newer members, who had often been overlooked, saw in the Terrans a potential ally. Kessler didn't participate in the shouting matches that followed. Instead, she simply observed, her eyes sweeping the room with quiet authority. Every glance she gave was a calculated move, every word from her lips carefully chosen. She knew that the true game had already begun. The assembly was no longer debating whether humanity would join them. They were debating how to survive their arrival. When the debate finally subsided, Kessler took a step forward, her expression unwavering. "You misunderstand us," she said. "We are not here to submit. We are here to shape the future, together. But you will never lead us again." The room fell into another heavy silence. The stakes had been set, and in that silence, the galaxy felt the first tremors of what was to come. The assembly hall on Caravel Prime had descended into a state of uneasy calm, but the real shifts were happening in the shadows. Away from the watchful eyes of the major powers, the Terran delegation worked tirelessly to forge alliances with the forgotten, the ignored, and the oppressed. Humanity's willingness to defy the Assembly's expectations was only the beginning. Now, it was time to play a different game. One of subterfuge, whispered agreements, and the quiet forging of new power structures. It began with the Isheri, a race of energy beings who had long been ignored by the larger, more powerful species. Their form, made of pure electromagnetic energy, could not be easily understood or manipulated, and thus they were often sidelined in galactic matters. The Isheri were one of many fringe species that found themselves left out of the powerful circles of the Assembly. To them, humanity's sudden rejection of the Assembly's norms was a breath of fresh air. When Kessler met with the Isheri representatives in a discreet, unmonitored room, she found an unlikely but receptive audience. The Isheri had been approached by countless other species over the years, but none had offered them the kind of mutual respect and autonomy the Terrans now promised. They had no interest in the grandiose empires of the galaxy, but rather in their own freedom to exist without the burden of interference from others. "We seek a partnership, not dominion," Kessler said, her voice calm, yet laden with an unspoken power. "We understand what it is like to be dismissed by those who think themselves superior. Humanity offers you something they can't, the freedom to choose your own future." Her words resonated with the Isheri. Though they did not speak in the same way as biological species, their exchange was far more profound. The agreement was not formalized in the traditional sense, but the pact was clear. The Isheri would support the Terrans' growing influence and allow humanity to help secure their sovereignty. But the Isheri were only the beginning. The Terrans also reached out to the Ascalani, a race of nomadic traders who had been exploited by the hegemony for centuries, and the Tsarnath, a warrior culture devastated by the barren empire's insidious expansion. Both species had been shunted aside in the Assembly's deliberations, but they recognized the opportunity in the Terrans' rise. They, too, agreed to the quiet alliance, offering their resources and expertise in exchange for protection from the Assembly's crushing bureaucracy. Humanity wasn't just seeking to join the fold, it was carving out a new path. The galaxy, in its complexity, had ignored those at the edges for too long. And now, those who had been cast aside were finding a voice, united under the banner of the Terran promise. Back in the Assembly chamber, the debate over the Terran proposal raged on. Yet, unbeknownst to the Assembly's leaders, the true power of humanity was already gathering, not in the halls of diplomacy, but in the shadowed corners where the forgotten were finding their strength. The galaxy was beginning to change, and it was no longer going to be dictated by those who held the most power. It would be shaped by those who had once been silenced. The Interstellar Assembly, once a bastion of order and negotiation, found itself teetering on the brink of chaos. No one could have anticipated the sheer audacity of humanity's move. When the Terran fleet, previously nothing more than a background presence, suddenly shifted from defense to offense, the galaxy was left in shock. It was an act of defiance that no one, not even the most hardened diplomats, had seen coming. It began with the Lorien system, a star system strategically located at the edges of the Assembly's territory. A small, uninhabited planet within the system was earmarked for mining operations by several large member species, including the Kalani, the esteemed amphibians who had long served as mediators in the Assembly. But when the Assembly authorized an expansion of mining rights into the Lorien system, It did so with little regard for the local non-member species that inhabited nearby systems. The Kalani had always been known for their calm, methodical approaches, but when they announced plans to colonize the Lorian system, many of the smaller, more vulnerable species protested. The Terrans, however, saw the situation differently. Rather than sit back, they took action. Without warning, a Terran fleet arrived at the edge of the Lorian system. They didn't issue a challenge, nor did they announce their arrival through any formal channels. They simply arrived. In an operation that left the galaxy stunned, the Terran ships destroyed the Kalani's mining equipment and disabled their fleet, forcing the Kalani to retreat with little more than a warning. It was swift. It was decisive. It was unprecedented. Kessler, when contacted by the Assembly to explain the Terran actions, remained eerily calm. "You did not ask us. You did not consider the people you claim to govern, nor the far-reaching consequences of your decisions. Humanity will not stand by while you continue to play God with the lives of others." The message was blunt, uncompromising, and perhaps most shockingly of all, it was true. The Assembly had made the mistake of assuming that humanity would bend to their will, would fall in line with their rules and regulations. But instead, the Terrans had shown that they would no longer be pawns in a game they didn't control. The Kalani were forced to retreat, but the larger implications were already unfolding. The news spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The Assembly tried to act quickly, condemning the Terrans' actions and issuing sanctions, but the damage was done. The question was no longer whether humanity would join the Assembly. It was how long the Assembly would survive now that humanity had taken its first bold steps into the galaxy's power structure. Kessler's actions, though legally questionable by the Assembly standards, had sent a shockwave throughout the galaxy. Some species, previously neutral, now looked at humanity with admiration and curiosity. Others, more established powers, watched with growing fear. The Terrans had made it clear. They were no longer asking for permission to exist among the stars. They were taking what they wanted, and they would no longer be held back. In the wake of the betrayal, the galaxy began to divide. The line had been drawn, and for the first time in millennia, the Assembly felt its control slipping. Humanity had just begun, and they weren't backing down. The galaxy trembled in the wake of the Terran betrayal, but the real war was just beginning. It wasn't a war fought with the massive fleets or grand battles of yore. Instead, it was an invisible war, an underground, digital, and diplomatic conflict that would reshape the balance of power in ways no one could have predicted. The Interstellar Assembly, desperate to maintain its authority, moved quickly to impose sanctions on humanity. Trade routes were closed. Diplomatic embassies were recalled. Military deterrents were placed at the borders of key Terran-controlled sectors. But in doing so, the Assembly only succeeded in isolating itself, showing its true colors to the galaxy, an institution that could not tolerate dissent. In response, the Terrans didn't push back with more guns or ships. Instead, they adapted. They played the game of diplomacy on their own terms, infiltrating the very systems that the Assembly used to keep control. Cyber warfare, covert ops, and diplomatic sabotage became the Terran arsenal. It began with data. Humanity, with its remarkable adaptability and technological prowess, had made quantum leaps in hacking and information warfare. Terran operatives, unseen and unnoticed, breached the Assembly's data vaults. They extracted classified documents, revealing the corruption within the galactic bureaucracy, secret deals, backroom trades, and countless acts of exploitation committed by the very members who had held themselves up as the paragons of justice. This treasure trove of information was then leaked, not through conventional media channels, but through a series of encrypted transmissions sent directly to the smaller, disaffected races, the ones who had always been marginalized by the Assembly. The truth was spreading, and it was doing so under the radar, far from the control of the larger powers. It wasn't just the Kalani or the Lecteri who were in trouble. It was every race that had ever been complicit in the Assembly's unscrupulous dealings. The Terrans had opened the floodgates, and now the entire galaxy was looking at the corruption that had festooned the assembly for centuries. As the leaks continued, the smaller species, those who had long been silenced or subjugated, began to rally behind the Terrans. They were no longer simply witnessing the rise of humanity. They were witnessing the emergence of a new force, one that promised to dismantle the old order. Humanity wasn't just challenging the assembly. They were offering a new vision for the galaxy, one built on transparency, freedom, and autonomy for all. But the assembly was not blind to this rising rebellion. Though they were caught in the labyrinth of their own bureaucracy, the leaders knew something had to be done. The Terrans were sowing dissent, and the consequences of that dissent could be catastrophic. If enough species rose up against the assembly, the galactic order could collapse. And so, while they continued their attempts at isolating humanity, they also began to secretly gather their own forces, races loyal to the old ways, who could help crush this insurrection before it spread any further. The invisible war was escalating, and neither side would relent. In the shadows, the Terrans were pulling the strings of revolution, while the assembly scrambled to preserve its decaying empire. The stage was set for a conflict unlike any the galaxy had ever seen, one that would be decided not on the battlefield, but in the hidden corners of power. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the outcome uncertain. But humanity, for the first time in centuries, was on the offensive, and they weren't going to stop until they had reshaped the galaxy. The Interstellar Assembly, once an unquestionable symbol of galactic order, was crumbling from within. The Terran strategy, though invisible to most, was proving to be a quiet juggernaut, slowly eroding the foundation of the galaxy's most powerful institution. With each passing day, the leaks grew more extensive, the discontent more visible, and the once immovable assembly began to fracture. Across the galaxy, factions were forming. The old powers of the assembly, those who had held sway for centuries, found themselves caught in a web of their own making, while the Kalani and Lecteri tried to maintain their positions with threats and sanctions. Their influence had been severely weakened by the Terrans' exposure of their hidden agendas. The leaks from the Terran-backed resistance had painted them as nothing more than ruthless, self-serving empires who exploited the smaller races while posing as the moral leaders of the galaxy. The Kalani, whose vast economic networks had once secured their dominance, found their trade agreements falling apart. The Lecteri, once feared for their military might, were suddenly seen as bullies whose strength was built on exploiting the weak. More and more planets, previously loyal to the assembly, began to withdraw their support. The Tarnith, the Ascalani, and countless other marginalized species began to turn their backs on the assembly, embracing the idea of a new galactic order, one led by humanity. The Terrans, in their quiet revolution, had managed to turn the tide. Their manipulation of information was masterful, but it was the promises of a better future that had truly won them the support of the galaxy's forgotten. They weren't just fighting for autonomy, they were offering the galaxy a chance to rebuild, a chance to start fresh. And that vision resonated with the disillusioned, the oppressed, and the ignored. Humanity's rise was now undeniable. The once small Terran alliance, built from the ashes of war, was rapidly becoming a coalition of rebellious systems. Fleet by fleet, sector by sector, the Terrans began to consolidate their power. They were not looking for domination. They were looking for a new kind of peace, one forged through cooperation, not subjugation. But the assembly was not finished. Desperate to maintain some semblance of control, its leaders began to marshal their forces. In an emergency meeting, the remaining members of the assembly's inner circle began to coordinate a military response. They had to act before the Terrans gained too much momentum. And yet, in their haste, they made a fatal miscalculation. Their plan involved a direct confrontation, an attempt to crush the Terran fleet and reassert their authority. But the Terrans, having anticipated this, had already prepared. Their own fleets, newly reinforced and growing by the day, were ready for battle. The galaxy was on the verge of war. The lines were drawn. Humanity, once the underdog, was now the greatest threat to the old order. In the shadow of this impending conflict, Kessler sat in the war room of the Terran flagship, staring at a galaxy map that glowed softly under the dim lights. The rebellion, though gaining strength, was not without its cost. The road ahead was fraught with peril, but one thing was clear: humanity would not be silenced. The old order was collapsing, and a new era was dawning. Would the galaxy fall into another cycle of destruction and chaos? Or could the Terrans, in their rebellion, build something better? Only time would tell. But Kessler knew one thing for sure: the stars would never shine the same way again. The tension in the galaxy had reached its breaking point. As the final battle lines were drawn, the fate of the interstellar assembly, and of the entire galaxy, hung in the balance. Humanity, once considered a mere curiosity in the grand scheme of galactic politics, had risen to become the most formidable force in the galaxy. Their revolution, though unconventional, had gained unstoppable momentum. And now the old order, with all its corruption and stagnation, was on the verge of collapse. Ambassador Kessler stood on the command bridge of the Excalibur, humanity's flagship, as the fleet assembled in orbit above Caravel Prime. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Behind her, the holographic display showed the massive fleets of the Terran Alliance, standing shoulder to shoulder with the once-forgotten species that had rallied to their cause. The Ascalani, the Tarnith, the Ishari, all of them now united under one banner. The galaxy was watching, waiting for the inevitable clash. "We've come a long way, but the hardest part is still ahead of us," Kessler murmured, her voice steady, but tinged with the weight of the responsibility she bore. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for the chance to rewrite this galaxy, to give it a future where power isn't concentrated in the hands of the few. The future is in our hands, but it's not guaranteed." Beside her, the captain of the Excalibur, Admiral Marcus Kane, nodded grimly. "The Assembly is preparing for an all-out assault. They're desperate to hold on to what little they have left, but they've underestimated us. They've underestimated the power of unity, of those who've been silenced for too long." The battle, when it came, was swift and brutal. The Terran fleets, bolstered by their new allies, engaged the forces of the Assembly with a ferocity that stunned even the most seasoned generals. The Kalani, Lektari, and Baron forces, while still formidable, were divided and outnumbered. Their fleets, once the epitome of power, were now nothing more than relics of an outdated order. Kessler watched as the battle unfolded on the viewscreen, the distant flashes of ship-to-ship combat lighting up the void of space. But even as the Terran Alliance emerged victorious, she knew that the true victory was not in the destruction of the Assembly's military might. It was in the collapse of the ideals that had upheld it for so long. The galaxy was no longer bound by the whims of a corrupt council, no longer under the thumb of those who sought to control everything from the shadows. As the dust settled, and the final remnants of the Assembly's forces retreated, Kessler stood before the shattered remnants of the Assembly, which would now be dissolved. The Terran flag, bold, proud, and untamed, was raised above what would become the first of many new galactic assemblies, ones built on equality and shared purpose. "The galaxy is ours to shape," Kessler said to her fellow leaders, her voice filled with both resolve and hope. "The future is no longer written by the old powers. It is written by those who dare to dream of something better." And so, under the banner of the Terran Alliance, the stars no longer shone with the weight of old conflicts and tyrannies. They gleamed with the light of a new era, one where every species, no matter their size or strength, would have a voice. The dawn of a new galactic order had arrived. The age of oppression was over. The age of humanity had just begun.